welcome to another episode of NBRI, the New Business and Retail Insights from the Center for Retailing Studies, Mays Business School, Texas A&M University. I'm your host, Venki Shankar, Director of Research and Coleman Chair, Professor of Marketing. It is my distinct honor to welcome our guest today, Dr. Marnik Dekimpe, a research professor of marketing and head of the marketing department at Tilburg University, the Netherlands, and also the professor of marketing at Catholic University Leuven, Belgium. He's won multiple Best Paper awards in leading marketing journals, as well as 2 long-term impact awards for papers published in the Journal of Marketing. In 2018, he was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Hamburg in Germany for his lifetime contributions to marketing research and education. He's a recipient of the AMA Marketing Strategy SIG Mahajan Award for lifetime contribution to marketing strategy research and the EMAC Distinguished Marketing Scholar Award, a lifetime achievement award granted by the European Marketing Academy. Marnik has served as the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Research and Marketing, the leading European marketing journal. He has been or is currently an associate editor of several leading marketing journals. He was an academic trustee with the Marketing Science Institute and is now an academic trustee with IMARC. Both these institutions connect academics with practitioners to enable managerially impactful research. Marnik has a PhD in marketing from the University of California at Los Angeles. Welcome, Marnik, for joining me in this conversation today. How have you been coping with the very uncertain COVID-19 situation in Europe?
Well, foremost and most important, my family and loved ones are healthy and fine. So that's the most important thing. Professionally, it has actually been now 6 months since I have been able to go to the office. Because first we had a prolonged lockdown. Then, given that I live in Belgium, work in Holland, then there were restrictions of crossing the border. And now we can go to the office with a small group, but I give priority to my junior colleagues who may have a higher need or of being together and working with their co-authors. Because I think it's a very difficult time if you're working on projects and if you're very early in your career.
That's very nice of you, and thank you for coping up with this difficult times. But this doesn't seem to have stopped your research, because you've been publishing at a tremendous pace, really high quality stuff. So congratulations on that. I did describe to you the usual way, but I would like you to describe yourself in maybe 5 words or less, maybe 5 phrases. How would you best describe yourself?
Okay, well, it's hard to describe yourself in 5 words, but I think I would first of all say that I'm fairly driven. If I want to figure something out, I'm basically go a long way to try to find an answer that satisfies me. The other 2 things is that I think I'm a fairly curious person. And meaning that if I observe certain things in the marketplace, and that's also why the retailing domain is such a fascinating domain, because we have all considerable domain knowledge being customers ourselves, is if I observe something that contradicts what we have been teaching for years in our classroom, then I basically want to figure out what's going on. And then the final and third characteristic, I think I really like my independence. And that's what I like so much in being an academic researcher, is that you basically can study what you find interesting. And there's not someone else who says, you have to study this. And I think that those would be the 3 main
Excellent
descriptors of me as a researcher.
Very good. So if I were to rephrase it, persistence, which you are very well known in doing research in, and experiential curiosity, and independence. So these 3 describe Marnik Dekimpe as an individual and a professional. Thank you very much. You've come a very, very long road. You've published so well in so many different domains. Give us a glimpse of your research journey. How did you move after your PhD, and how did you move across different domains and the twists and turns that you experience. It'd be great for us to know.
Okay. I think research-wise, in terms of the topic, I see myself a bit as, say, an applied econometrician who studies interesting marketing problems that have a high managerial relevance and that happen to often be in the domain of retailing. And just to illustrate how I got started in my PhD, I basically introduced to the marketing field the notion of vector autoregressive models, and you already used the term, Venki, persistence modeling, which is basically an approach to look to quantify the long-term impact of marketing activities. And in a nutshell, the underlying idea there is that if a company or a brand does a certain marketing activity, think a promotion, what can happen is that consumers, because of the promotion, they buy the product. So you see a sales spike. But in the coming periods, they may first use up what they have in their fridge. So you see a post-promotion dip. However, those customers that initially tried your product may like it and start to repeat buy after their inventory has been depleted. The manager may observe that, gee, if I do a promotion, my sales go up, so they do an additional promotion. Your competitors may see that this is successful, and they may also start to do promotions in order to try to gain your customers back. As a consequence, and that's the argument in that whole persistence modeling approach, is that if you really want to give credit to the initial promotion of how successful it has been, that you should also take into account that chain reaction of events that follow it. Now, the modeling approach that was used for that, and that's why I myself an applied econometrician, in the sense that I will not be the person that develops a new test statistic or the person that develops a new estimation procedure. But what we did is to translate concepts that had become popular in economics and finance and translate it to the marketing domain. And then most importantly, what we did is applied that approach to thousands of brands, thousands of promotions across hundreds of categories in order to start to figure out under what circumstances do promotions work, under what circumstances do they work better, and under what circumstances do they not work. And I like to tell a short story about a presentation that I gave to a group of several hundred managers. And I said, look, in our research, we find that only 30% of the promotions are actually revenue enhancing, let alone profit enhancing. Who believes that? Everyone was raising their hands. And then my second question is, the last promotion that you did, was it successful? And everyone raised their hand that their promotion was very successful, even though they believe that in total only 30% works. And so what we tried then to find out is, in a more concentrated market, in a market where private labels are more successful, in a market where the national brands do more advertising, or promotions more or less successful there. Then doing that analysis, one of the things that really jumped out was that the impact of those promotions, but we found the same thing for new product introductions, for advertising, was very different for national brands manufacturers versus for retailers, or for national brands versus private label. And then we started to think of why could that be the case? And this basically was the onset of my curiosity on how do those national brand manufacturers and private labels, the retailers, how do they interact with one another? Is there a power shift? Under what conditions can they collaborate? Under what conditions can you create win-win situations, and so forth? And once you're into that route, also then having good doctoral students who come also with ideas in that domain, and having access to good data, given my connections with AMARC and GFK, basically leads from one project to the other
Okay.
In that domain of manufacturing retailer interface.
That's fascinating, because you started with a mastery of time series methods, which you are bringing from finance and accounting into marketing. And that led you to really discover that the impact of promotions, advertising, new product introduction, et cetera, short and long term, was a ripe area. And while doing that, you also discovered there are some asymmetry between national brands and private labels. And then you started digging deeper and look at all the interplays, which is very amenable to some kind of a time series analysis, because you've got so many different variables at play, so many dependent variables, so you could analyze them. But what happened, I also noticed that you started working on problems relating to business cycles, right? For example, you started looking at recessions versus high economic growth periods, and that also started a series of papers that came out of your research. So tell us something about that journey.
Well, for that journey, I have to give credit to my doctoral student at the time, Barbara de Leersneder, because she came up with the idea that, hey, there seems to be some business press articles that make claims about the impact of the recession on private label success. So the private labels are back there. And so she gave me 1 or 2 papers on the method and asked, do you think there's something in here? And I started reading about this and started to get really, really excited about this, because what you noticed is that there were tons, well, not tons, but several business press reports that made all kinds of claims about the impact of the business cycle on national brands, what they should be doing, and none of that was basically substantiated with solid empirics. So what we then did initially was try to collect data, which we needed to span several decades, because, well, given that, say, a typical business cycle lasts between 2 and 8 years, if you want to have a couple of business cycles in your data, you need a couple of decades of data. And what we then basically found was that not that surprising, that private labels behaved counter-cyclical. If the economy goes down, private labels go up. That was fairly expected, but it's always nice that your first finding
research,
supports common sense.
Right. Okay.
But what we then found is that that dependency is asymmetric. So if there's a crisis, or an economic crisis, that private label share rises very rapidly. While if the economy improves, then the national brands regain some ground, but this goes at a much slower pace. Now, that's already much more interesting. And then the third thing made us even more exciting, in that we could show empirically that a significant chunk of the people, or of that increase, was basically very sticky and stayed with their private labels. So if you have a succession of recessions, each time
private labels benefit a lot,
lose some ground, and they never recover it. So they each time stabilize at a lower plateau. And then there's the next crisis, and that repeats. And then
that's a fascinating discovery, yeah. And is it mainly because,
of course,
sorry, I was going to say, is it something specific to Europe, where the share of private label and the role of private labels are much higher than in the US? Or do you think it would hold across?
No, this is a common phenomenon. In some other paper, we also looked, then in the discussion section, and the reviewers brought it up, is this something that the managers can do something about that? And so in a follow-up paper, we looked at how do national brand manufacturers and retailers react during a recession and an expansion. And then what we basically found was that a big part of that drop for the national brand manufacturers during the recession is due to the way they behave. Namely, they cut back on their advertising, they cut back on their innovations, and because of that, they are basically
losing ground to private labels. Yeah.
And then coming back to your question, we repeated that analysis across more than 30 different countries. And this was a very consistent finding, is that in those countries where national brand manufacturers cut back more on advertising, cut back more on some of those other activities, is where the private labels grow more during those recession periods. So this is not a European phenomenon. This is basically a global phenomenon.
That's exciting to know. And then I noticed that you also moved on to analyze product harm crisis, right? You also started looking at what is the impact when there are recalls, for example, food recalls, and you look at multiple industries in several of your papers. So share us something about how you started working on it and what kind of insights you derived out of those.
Actually, this is again, most of those projects sometimes start coincidentally. And I was a VAR modeler, or persistence modeler, as we started out in the beginning. And my good friend Harold van Heerde gave a talk where he used another methodology. And I asked tons of questions during his presentation, and he claimed his method was better. I claimed that my method was better. And then after a while, we came across that problem of a product harm crisis that I initially started to work on with my method, and I must admit it didn't work very well. And so I contacted Harold, and we started working together on that. And so this was the case of a salmonella poisoning in peanut butter, where several people died. And what we basically were able to show is that during a product harm crisis, there is much more going on than what managers typically think, in the sense of losing market share, losing sales, losing reputation. What they also, basically they have multiple jeopardies that they face. They become more sensitive to price attacks of their competitors. Their own effectiveness of their advertising drops. They become more price sensitive. So basically, even if the crisis is over, if the managers want to recover from that, they have to do much more extra effort to do that because the effectiveness of their instruments have also been jeopardized. And then coming back to your earlier question, is we could show that in one case, and it was interesting. We published that, etc. But then we started to wonder, is this always the case? And so we collected data on more than 60 different product harm crises in multiple countries and started to look for empirical generalizations, which is something that I very often try to achieve in my research, is to replicate across many different instances, many different brands, many different crises in this case, not only because it gives us some more confidence that this is a repeatable or generalizable pattern, but then you can also start to look at contingency factors. In that case, the impact is higher or lower. And what we, for example, then also could bring to the table in terms of managerial recommendations is that different recovery strategies should be followed depending on whether or not the brand was to blame for the crisis, but also how much publicity it received in the press. And so depending on what setting you were facing, that in some cases you needed to increase your price and drop your advertising. In other settings, it was better to do just the opposite, so that we could, again, give managers some concrete recommendations in that particular situation you face. You may want to do this, or you may want to do this.
Yeah, I love that about your research. A hallmark of your research is you always strive for empirical generalization and try to get some insights that can be generalized across categories, maybe contexts and so on. And in the process, you also look at the contingency factors or moderating conditions, which is also a very wonderful feature of your research. Now, I also noticed that you are also doing that now in conjunction with the effects of advertising, and particularly you're focusing a lot on FMCG, or frequently moving consumer goods, or what we call CPG, or consumer packaged goods in the US. So are most of your research focused on these mainly because of the data, or are these because you are genuinely interested in these categories per se?
Well, it's basically a mixture of things.
Okay.
In the sense that several of my research projects also start with observations that
Correct,
I
yeah.
have in the marketplace. So, and I observe more in that market than in others. So that's one. The second thing is, as you correctly mentioned, is that the data availability in that domain is typically larger or is more easily accessible than in some other markets. But that being said, I recently started to work also on some projects where we have retail scanner data on a variety of consumer durables. So again, I am very excited about that project too, but given that I'm an applied econometric researcher, I need the data. And that's also very often the driving force of where do you have the data.
So what are some of the new research projects that you're working on? And I noticed that you've published a lot in the last couple of years alone, and still more papers are forthcoming. So tell us something about what you're working on that may be exciting for you.
Well, one thing that, one paper that I recently published and that you're familiar with is on how retailers should brand their private labels. And there are two aspects that I have looked at there. Is first of all what you see, and this is
Marnik,
again
sorry to interrupt you. Before you go further, just for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, maybe we could unpack the private labels a little bit in here, because maybe you could give an overview of the private labels versus national brands in Europe and the US. What you see as the trend. Let me give you my own observations and take is that private labels share of at least the CPG or the FMCG categories are growing all over the world. And as you rightly mentioned earlier on, during the recessions, they gain a lot of shares and they keep it up. But one of the interesting thing, let me just put this out in terms of very, very striking examples here, is the growth of private label on big retailers in the US, like Amazon, Walmart. For example, Amazon has multiple private labels. When I last counted, they have about 406 private label brands. Of course, Amazon Basics is the biggest one. And then they have Amazon Collection, and they have Amazon Essentials, so many different collections across product categories. Similarly, Walmart has great value and number of other private label. And where we are in Texas, H-E-B is a very big brand. H-E-B has its own private label, H-E-B Regular, Hill Country. So there is a lot of excitement about private labels or store brands in the US, but I understand those are much, much higher in in Europe, across Europe. So first of all, having laid out how this industry and the importance of private label is evolving, perhaps you can give a background about why this branding, the different umbrellas are important before you can talk about your research so that we all get a better sense.
Okay, so first to put everyone a bit on the same playing field, what you in terms of private label shares, what you do see is that they are still much higher in Europe on average than in the US. I think in the US, it will be, depending on the data source that you're looking at, they will say between 20 and 25%, give or take 1 or 2%. In Europe, there are several countries where it's more than 40% and even already exceeding 50%, which basically means that 1 out of 2 products being sold in the supermarket are no longer national brands, which is really impressive. So what are then the expectations for the US? And is that there's a general feel that the US will start to become more and more like Europe in terms of the shares. Whether they will reach the exact same level and say reach full convergence to the European level, that's another question, and that's a paper I'm working on for the moment. But if you just one of the reasons why I'm convinced that in the US it will rise is first of all that the consumer perception is changing. It used to be, and that was one of the main reasons why in Europe it was higher than in the US, was that in Europe, private labels had a better quality perception. If you ask the European consumers, do you think the private labels are as good as the national brands? A vast majority would say yes. In the US, that was, say, approximately 1 out of 2 consumers. The latest figures that I have seen in the US is that already around 80% of the US consumers are also saying that the quality of private labels is as good as the quality of
Marnik,
national brands.
you make an excellent point, because with COVID, what has happened is it's accelerated that perception of high quality of private label. A lot of people are substituting national brands for the brands of Amazon, for example. Amazon has exploded during this, and so is Walmart. And mainly because the stockouts of national brands plus the availability of that, and when consumers start experiencing, they are gravitating more towards auto ordering, if you will. So your point is very well taken, particularly this pandemic has accelerated that. Also, another striking couple of information that I found was even Starbucks is producing some of its coffee for Kirkland, which is Costco's private label, right? And Kirkland's private label coffee says roasted by Starbucks. So you have actually, more established brands manufacturing for the private label, which actually takes it to a different level, right?
Yes. I wrote a paper on that, on who is producing those private labels a couple of years ago. And basically what you had is that there's of course a big chunk of the private labels being produced by, say, dedicated private label producers. So all they do is produce private labels.
Correct.
And those are typically producing at very low margins and are squeezed out by the retailers. Then the second big chunk is made by the national brand manufacturers. And they do produce that basically for a variety of reasons. And one is, of course, if the private labels take 40%, like in some European countries, they have overcapacity. And so either you can just close down your factories, or you can produce it for the retailer for its private labels. But what we found was one of the key reasons why they are doing that is to then have preferential treatment from the retailer for their national brands. And so basically, we did that in the context of the hard discounters, who, as you know, have very few national brands, but they are very attractive to get those spots. And what we found is that if you start to, Aldi, Lidl, and the Lidl is now very, they are Lidl is now very hot in the US. And,
right, they are growing like very fast.
Like crazy. And what we found is that if you start as a national brand manufacturer, if you produce the private labels for the discounters, that you have a much higher likelihood that you are one of the lucky few that is selected to be offered on the shelves of that discounter. So if you then take into account that the discounters in Germany have 30 to 40% of the market, that suddenly opens a whole market again if you are able to get your product on that. But coming back a bit, Venki, to COVID, what may also be one of the consequences of that COVID crisis is that an evolution that was already going on, and that the retailers were integrating more vertically and producing their private labels on their own. So not independent contractors, not national brand manufacturers, but basically owning the factories, that this is going to accelerate. And the reason is that the retailers want to have more control over their supply chain. so that they are not dependent if suddenly there's a crisis outbreak, say in China, that they have supply problems.
Very good point. And I think now that you put this in context, let's try and understand why should private label or store retailers have different tiers of private label, which is what you're looking at, right? You're looking at the types of brands I need to have. Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, it's a typical segmentation exercise in the sense that you want to reach different segments of consumers. With some extra remarks. First of all, the reason why, so let's for the moment talk about 3 tiers, say economy or budget, then the standard tier, and then the premium tier. Basically, the budget tier is introduced as a defensive weapon against the hard discounters. So they basically introduce that very cheap version of the private label in order to fight the Aldis and the Lidls of this world. However, there is evidence both in the business press, but also in some recent academic papers that this objective is hard to realize. So it's not really that successful. And because of that, the budget or economy private label is also not growing anymore. Moreover, they have a very small margin and they cannibalize the standard private labels with a higher margin. So there are more and more retailers that are, without much fuss, are starting to discontinue their economy private label. Where the growth and the money is at the moment is in the premium private label, where the quality is typically higher or at least at par as with the leading national brands. They are now sometimes even more expensive than the national brands, but they are the fastest growing tier. And why do the retailers do that? First of all, because they have the highest margin. They have the same percentage margin as the standard tier, but given that it's applied to a higher price, in terms of, say, dollar terms, they earn most on the premium tier.
But that also poses a challenge, Marnik, because they have to also market it substantially higher, right? Because they have to justify the price and compete with the national brands. So how does that happen in Europe successfully? Because we don't see a lot of such premium private label here in the US, as much as you see in Europe.
Yeah. No, one of the interesting things is that they basically use the premium private label as a real differentiating tool vis-a-vis the competing retailers, but also to attract the customers to their store. And what's then an interesting development that you see in several European countries is that in those categories, because premium private labels you only do in a select set of categories, not across the board as with the standard one, is that in those categories where you have that premium private label, is that the retailer is also supporting the national brands more. Because they want to, suppose that you introduce your premium private label, say, in a certain, say, fancy chocolate category. Then you see that they expand also the assortment of the leading national brands in that category.
That's fascinating.
They also it's fascinating. And they basically together with the national brands and their premium private label, they want to make that the destination categories, where
Very
they
nice.
then start to make money. And then once they have created a name to do that, then they start to also alternate the promotions so that there are certain weeks where it's the premium private labels that's really in promotion. And then during those weeks, they make a ton of money given the high margins on those things.
Very good. So they essentially behave like a national brand at that premium private label, right? And you know, one of the lay people's questions would be that, gee, you know, the whole promise of private label or store brand is that it's value for money. And if you start unpacking multiple layers and multiple tiers and having multiple different brand names for your own private label across categories, doesn't it become very confusing for the consumer? And also, doesn't it become very hard for the retailer to support, making people aware of so many different brand names? I'm just laying the context for your research. So how does this all play out, and why do retailers have so many different names to begin with?
Well, historically, they used to have many, say, different private label names for every category. So they had a different name for their private label in the spaghetti sauce category, another name for the chocolate category, still another name for yet another category. What you see now is that first of all, that's complicated for the retailer and potentially confusing for the customer. What you now see is that more and more retailers, but not all, but say around, I would say 60, 70%, start to use what we call an umbrella brand name. And basically what they do is then combine all the different separate private label names that individually do not have the muscle to really convey a strong message to the customer, to bring that under one common
roof,
name. And once they have decided that, many of those retailers also then attach their own banner name to that common name. So, and you see that with Tesco, you have Tesco Premium, Tesco Value, Tesco, so that each time you have the Tesco name attached to it. And the reason why they do that is because the private labels have become so strong that they carry their own equity, and the retailer tries to create a synergy effect between the equity perception of its banner and the equity perception of its private label in order to have that cross-fertilization. What's interesting, however, is that they attach their banner name much less to the budget private label. And the reason is that these are lower quality. There is more danger, coming back to a previous topic, of a product harm crisis, and they don't want to take that risk. But you're absolutely correct that this becomes much more complicated logistically for the retailer. At some point, we may see again a rationalization. Like Tesco, I counted for a project the number of private label brands that they currently have, and they had 13 different ones, which of course is rather confusing potentially to the customer. But we'll see what the future brings here.
So now lay out what you found in your umbrella branding private label research. So now that we have a broader context.
Yes. Well, with the umbrella branding paper, what we looked at is for several retailers that switched from, say, 50, 60 different names to one common brand name. And we again, given that I like things that are not idiosyncratic to one retailer, we had several retailers across 2 different countries, retailers with a different positioning, etc. And consistently we find that as the business press and the managers hope for, is that the brand strength increased. So with the brand strength, we measured that as how much sales do you basically realize without promotional support, without advertising support, without with the price at, say,
so
either
the
baseline
sales,
or the maximum level.
Yeah, some kind of baseline sales. Yeah.
Yes, and what we found is that after that rebranding exercise, that the intrinsic base sales or the intrinsic brand strength of those private labels increased in each of the cases that we observed or that we studied. So that basically means that your brand becomes stronger if you can have a consistent message or a consistent use of that brand across different categories throughout the store, rather than spreading yourself too thin with too many different brand names. However, there was also a caveat to that, in the sense that the promotional effectiveness and the effectiveness of assortment increases, so adding extra SKUs, that this became smaller, which also makes sense and which is consistent with prior literature, that if promotional frequency increases, that the effectiveness of each individual goes down. Right. And what you now have is, you walk through the aisles, you see a promotion for coffee for that name. You continue, you see a promotion for that same name in the soft drink category. And same thing with the assortment, is that the perception of assortment variety decreases if you use the same name, same packaging, same logo, etc., across different categories throughout the store. So yes, there is a positive baseline effect, but you have to be careful and realize that the effectiveness of, say, an individual promotion or the effectiveness of an SKU addition becomes smaller once you have done that.
That's fascinating, because what you're saying is that the whole private label strategy or set of decisions is involving a lot of trade-offs, right? So first of all, the need to have an umbrella private label versus different brand names by categories, and then need to have multiple tiers, and also coexisting with national brands. All of this is a very intricate interplay of a lot of factors, right? And so there is no one rule or one strategy that might work for every retailer, right? So you could, exactly. It's much more nuanced, looks like, right?
Yeah. And for example, what we found is that, say, different strategies in terms of naming your private label, or working with an umbrella, etc., or attaching your name to it, differs depending on what tier you're talking about, differs depending on what retail market you're working in. It works better one strategy in a concentrated market than in another. It depends on your positioning as a retailer. For example, attaching your banner name to your private labels works better if you're a high-low retailer than if you're an EDLP retailer, and so forth. So there are lots of different things that have to be taken into account, which for us as a researcher makes it all the more fascinating.
Yeah. That's why I was going to say, you've elevated the whole concept of private label and store brand to another level altogether, which is becoming very important. Now let's look forward a little bit. Where do you see the role of brands, private labels going in the next 5 to 10 years? You already mentioned that US, you expect to see a rising share of private label, but let me put the context in place here. You know, we have the COVID situation. A lot of consumers are moving to online shopping. Many of them are moving to, private label or store brands if it's acceptable to them. Many of them are auto ordering. We have all these AI and automated assistants. Do you think that we are reaching a situation where it's going to become harder and harder for both national brand manufacturers and retailers to really successfully carve out consistently higher market shares over a period of time, because it's becoming more and more very less persuasive environment, if I were to call it, right?
Yeah. No, that's a very good question. And this is one where I basically need to do a lot of speculation. And just last week, I sent in a review paper to the Journal of Retailing on that multi-tiered offering and the impact of COVID and so forth. And there are a lot of basically moving targets going on. And for example, it's more and more consumers are now starting to buy online. We know that because of COVID. However, we basically don't know, we know almost nothing in the academic field about the interface between private label buying and online buying. And yes, Amazon is really shaking
Dominating.
up that whole, dominating it. And because of that, you will see a big increase in private label shares on sales online. That's one. Two, we have the COVID
And to your point,
situation.
Marnik, sorry to interrupt. To your point, I believe Amazon Basics, in the battery has become the single largest manufacturer and brand. So that is fascinating to observe. If it can happen in one category, it could happen in multiple categories, right?
Yes. Plus also, if you saw a couple of years back, Amazon was already selling multiple brands which were actually private labels, but it was not really put to the fore. And then they started putting arrows. This is a private label, this is a private label. So that basically they were using that as their selling proposition. However, coming back to COVID, consumers may also look for trust. And so it's unclear yet whether they will go back to the trusted national brands or whether the retailer brands have already created enough trust, have already created enough long-lasting, persistent equity in order to overcome that. So that's a bit difficult to predict. What you also is something that really fascinates me now is, given that I think we are heading for a big recession, is that you would expect that the budget private label, which was stagnating, may actually get a boost again, because, well, they are the really cheapest at still acceptable quality. Not top quality, but acceptable quality. But on the other hand, and this is something that we have for the first time, and which makes the COVID crisis very different from, say, the traditional ones, is that customers also feel isolated. They need to have a connection, that because of that, they may want to, if they have to stay at home, they may want to indulge in something good, something special, which would basically then tell that the premium private label will be the one that will benefit.
Could it be depending on categories? For some categories, they might like to indulge, like chocolates. They might want to have a premium one, but maybe for ketchups and very spaghetti sauces, they could go in for maybe lower or the economy private label. You think that might happen?
Yes. Yeah, I think that will happen. And if you look in what categories that the retailers tend to introduce the premium private label, it's in the hedonic categories and things like that, not in the utilitarian categories.
Very good,
So, and what will be interesting to tease out is what will be driven by say, demand factors that the customer has a need for to indulge, or the consumer is driven more by budgetary constraints. So two opposing factors there.
Very
but will also be driven to a large extent by the supply side factors. Where will the retailer put their money? And then just another supply side factor that comes to mind is when I talk with people in industry in Europe now, is that they start to notice that gradually the retailers are using also the COVID crisis to reduce the number of national brand SKUs and replace it with their private label SKUs. Claiming, and I don't know, I haven't researched it yet, but claiming that this is because of supply side considerations. But some industry observers think that this may also be inspired by, this is an opportunity, given that some national brand manufacturers do have supply
shortages,
issues.
Yeah. So this is excellent projections, Marnik, and we have a little bit of time left. In the limited time, I would like you to think about what would be your best advice or best suggestions for, we have a wide variety of audience, students, former students, entrepreneurs, managers, some administration, public policy officials. So what would be some of the things that you would recommend or suggest them for them to look going forward in these areas that we talked about?
Okay, say starting with students, doctoral students, research
Right.
master students, I think even though these are very difficult times, these are also very fascinating times. Several of the domains that we might have felt are fairly saturated are suddenly shaken up. And so there are tons of new research opportunities. Second thing for the students is to always keep in mind is that it's important to have fun with your research. So to always pick things that are fun. In terms of, say, for the managers in the audience, I think we can refer to the Chinese word for the symbols for crisis. It's a crisis and it's an opportunity. Okay, so yes, there are difficult times ahead, and some industries will be affected tremendously, but there are also some opportunities. And that was one of the key findings that I also had in my previous business cycle research, is that as an individual manager, you cannot stop an economic recession. It happens, but depending on what you are doing, you can
learn from it
attenuate
and
considerably how much you're being affected. And yes, there are a lot of unknowns, but there is also a lot of research available that can help managers in those decisions.
Excellent. So on that note, I'm going to thank you because it's been fascinating always discussing your research and your findings. And I always enjoy the generalizability and the interesting angles that you bring to the research. And I'm sure all the viewers and listeners would have benefited from listening to you on this. Thank you very much again, Marnik, and wish you good luck with your future research and hope you can continue to inform us with your insights moving forward. Thank you again.